I'd invite you to take your Bibles, turn to the book of Isaiah, chapters 15 and 16. About once a month, I'm going to try to bring a sermon from the book of Isaiah. There's 66 chapters, and there's a lot going on in this book. But maybe by doing this, we'll be able to better appreciate this old prophet and then learn some lessons along the way for us as well. I want to remind you that when Isaiah is prophesying, it's a time when the Assyrians are rising into power. And he is warning those in the land of Israel and all the little nations round about what's going to happen as Assyria rises into power. It's all part of God's plan to work things out for the salvation of the world. And one thing Isaiah does that is very peculiar is throughout all these prophecies, he keeps pointing to a time when there's going to be a king in Jerusalem. Well, the Israelites often thought, well, it'll be a king like David. But Isaiah's pointing to the Christ that would come in Jerusalem. And we're going to see that in this prophecy as well. It's not the main thrust here, but there's one verse that really stands out about that. And we'll see that as we get to it. Now, as we look at this PowerPoint picture here, that's called the Moabite stone. We're going to be talking about what's going to happen in Moab when the Assyrians come, and I want to give a little history of these people called the Moabites. The Moabite stone was discovered, I believe they said it was 1870. Up on a high place over in the land of Moab called Dibon. And we're going to read about Dibon in this very passage here. Well, it was not long after it was discovered, it was smashed in pieces. And they got over there and they found most of the pieces and put it back together. And to save it from the destruction, they sent it off to Paris, France. It's in the Louvre, not cemetery, museum. Looks like a tombstone, doesn't it? The Louvre in Paris, France. And on this Moabite stone, they pieced it together and deciphered some of the names and words, and there's a way to read that stone now, and they find the name of Omri, who was a king in Samaria, we read about in the Bible. And his son, it doesn't mention his son by name, but it mentions his son Ahab. And it talks about how the Moabites had attacked an Israeli fortress and carried off the vessels of Jehovah. It's the earliest inscription we have of the name of God that we know of in the world is there on that Moabite stone, the name of Jehovah. And they brought it to their idol, Chemosh. And we're going to read about Chemosh here, or at least in this lesson we'll talk about Chemosh, their idol god. So I thought that was interesting, and I'll just start with the Moabite stone. They find these things in archaeology, and then it corresponds to what we read about in the Scriptures, and that's interesting as well. So let's talk about this. My heart shall cry out for Moab, Isaiah says. Isaiah 15:1 begins the burden of Moab. When the prophets had bad news, it was a burden. It's so different from the good news of the gospel in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, it was the bad news of the burden. I've got some bad news for Moab. He says in verse 5, my heart shall cry out for Moab. In Isaiah 16 in verse 9, I will water thee with my tears. And then Isaiah 16:11, my bowels shall sound like a harp for Moab. Well, I don't know what you're thinking when you read that, but what he's talking about, his bowels, he's talking about from the most inside. I'll just be moaning for Moab. And just like someone playing a harp off key or in a minor key, He's talking about the grief he's going to have because of the bad news that he's got to deliver to the Moabites about these Assyrians that are coming. And the reason was their pride. Isaiah chapter 16 in verse 6. We've heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud. Even his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. It's interesting to me that Moabite stone is a monument to the pride of Moab. What they're doing on that stone, they're bragging about how they have taken these things from the people of God and from Israel and have thrown them off, and that's all engraved on that stone. And they're going to be punished because of that pride. All right? Let's see. The history. Why should Moab be proud? You know where the nation came from? Remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? Lot was there. He escaped out of Sodom, and only his wife and his 2 daughters with him. They were not married. Remember the story? His wife looked back, was told not to look back. She looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. And so Lot, he flees with his daughters, and he's hiding in a cave. And his daughter says, "We don't have any husband. What are we going to do for children?" And they got their father drunk, and they conceived seed of their father. And the eldest gave birth to the little boy she called Moab. And it tells us the same as the father of the Moabites unto this day. Well, now Lot is Abraham's nephew. And so back in their history, the children of Israel are of Abraham, and these children of Moabite come out of Lot. And so there's a kinship there between these peoples. And they tell us the language was similar. The archaeologists do, and their alphabets were similar. That's the reason he's able to read that Moabite stone, because there's a similar alphabet to that of Israel. And so they're of near kin, but they were often enemies. We read about Moab. Here's where they settled, those children of Moab. And I really like this map because it doesn't show a definite area. We often think about certain boundaries, for states and nations, and it wasn't quite like that in the old time. It's just in this area where they settled. You might see on there Dibon. I want you to notice that. On that Ammon River, that's where the Moabite stone was found. And these people had settled there and were living there when the children of Israel came through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And God told them, says, "Now don't go through Moab, but go around the borders." And so they went around the borders of Moab and camped right over against Jericho. You might see there's Jerusalem, or right across from Jerusalem at the top of the Dead Sea. That's where Jericho would be found. And they encamped in the plains of Moab. That's where Moses gave them the book of Deuteronomy. That Deuteronomy is a series of speeches, sermons that Moses gave on the old law there on the plains of Moab. Remember, Moses went up to Mount Nebo. And that's where he died. He could overlook the promised land, but wasn't able to enter. Mount Nebo is part of in that area where the Moabites lived. And then we read the story of Balaam and Balak in Numbers 22 through 25. The king of the Moabites, Balak, did not like them camping there on his plains and was worried about this multitude of people that had come out of the desert, and sent for this prophet Balak to curse them. And as you read the story, 4 times Balaam tried to curse the children of Israel. And all 4 times, instead of curses coming out of his mouth, blessings came out of his mouth. Well, Balak had about had his fill of that. But Balaam gave Balak some counsel. He said, instead of us trying to curse them, let them bring curses on themselves. And so the daughters of Moab went out, and the men of Israel were enticed by the daughters of Moab to commit fornication, in part of seeking some guidance or some favor from their god Chemosh and Baal. And the Lord slew a great host of the children of Israel that day because of their sin. Later we read about Eglon and Ehud. The children of Israel came on into the promised land, and they took the promised land, but they turned and did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And God raised up a king, Eglon, out of the Moabites, and he came over and oppressed those Israelites that had rebelled against him. And then the children of Israel turned back to God. And Ehud, the judge, he was left-handed. Being left-handed, he had his sword where it was hidden. When they searched him before he went into the king, they didn't find his sword. And we got to the king, says, I have a message for you, king. And he pulled his sword and killed King Eglon. And then Ehud ran and rallied the armies of Israel together, and they threw off the Moabites. It said the land had rest for 80 years. That's 80 years. During that time, we read about Ruth and Boaz. There was a famine around the lands of Bethlehem. And Naomi and her husband went down to the land of Moab to seek escape from this time of famine. And she took her 2 sons with them. And the 2 sons married Moabite women. But then Naomi's husband died, and her 2 sons died. And Naomi says, I'm going to return to Bethlehem. And Ruth, her daughter-in-law, went with her and took care of her in Bethlehem. And when Boaz, a near kinsman to Naomi, saw what Ruth was doing and taking care of her mother-in-law like that, he took Ruth to be his own wife. And she bore him a son named Obed, who bore the little boy, Jesse, who bore the son of David. And so Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David. And we read about Ruth in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1, in the genealogy of Christ, going through David, it tells us about Boaz and Ruth. Well, that's a good story. Saul became king, and hostilities between Moab and Israel returned. And while Saul was trying to chase David while he was a fugitive of law, David was worried about his parents. So he took his parents down to the land of Moab to seek refuge in the land of their grandmother. It was David's great-grandmother, but his parents' grandmother. Took his parents there. And then David became king. And when David became king, he ruled over Moab and passed that rule on down to his son Solomon. And Solomon, he married many, many wives. And among the many wives he married, it mentioned he married wives of the daughters of Moab. He brought them to Jerusalem. And to please his wives, he built a shrine in Jerusalem to their god Chemosh. Of course, it wasn't pleasing to God. He may have pleased his wife, but he didn't please the Lord. Well, after Solomon, we read about how Moab rebelled against the rule that the Israelites had over them, and that's engraved in that Moabite stone. And that corresponds to 2 Kings chapter 3, when Jehoshaphat and Joram, with the Lord's help, was able to subdue the Moabites again. Now, that's been the history of Israel and the Moab down through the years. But now the Assyrians were coming. I want to carry us through Isaiah chapter 15 and 16. Get your Bibles and open them up, and we'll read down through there and note what the prophet is saying. Now, in this, we're going to read about the names of a lot of places, and some of these names are a little hard to pronounce. I'll do the best I can with them. But you're going to hear what Isaiah's bad news that he's got for Moab. The burden of Moab. Because in the night, Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Because of the night, Ker of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Sounds like they were overthrown in the night, these two little villages. Maybe it was a night raid that took them down. And so the men of Moab turn to their gods and go to the high places to plead for their gods to protect them from these Assyrians. That's why it says he's gone up to Bajith and to Dibon. Now there's that Dibon where they found the Moabite stone. They went up to these high places, Nebo and Mabeda or other high places. They went up there to weep. And it was on these high places where they had these shrines to their gods to whom they were praying. But it didn't do them any good. They come down and their heads are baldness and their beards cut off, and in the streets they gird themselves with sackcloth. That shame and remorse and humility they have. And on the tops of the houses and in the streets, everyone shall howl. And then the King James Version says, weeping abundantly. If you have another translation, it might say something like, and they came down weeping. They went up to appeal to their gods, but they come back in shame, and they come down weeping because those false gods can't do them any good against these Assyrians. And then here's some of the little villages. Heshbon shall cry, and Eliah, their voice shall be heard, even into Yahaz. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out, his life shall be grievous unto him. And Isaiah says, my heart shall cry out for Moab. His fugitives shall flee to Zor. And then this little strange comment, and heifer 3 years old. Sometimes we're not sure what the Bible is talking about. But a heifer 3 years old is old enough for sacrifice. Maybe that's why Zor is compared to a heifer 3 years old. That's going to be taken too. They flee to this little city by the Dead Sea for refuge, but they're ready for sacrifice. But by the mounting up of Luith and the weeping, they shall go up to it. For the way of Horonaim, they shall rise a cry of desolation. And then the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate. Well, that country out there is fed by these rivers, but these little rivers. But what if some thought, well, maybe the Assyrians plugged up their rivers, or maybe the land just went dry in time of drought, but it affects their crops. The hay is withered away. The grass faileth. There's no green thing. Therefore the abundance they have gotten, into which they laid up, shall carry away to the brook of the willows. For the cry is gone round about the borders of Moab, howling thereof unto Eglaim, and the howling thereof into Beryllium. For the waters of Damon shall be full of blood. For I will bring more upon Damon. Damon. The name means blood. And it is thought by the commentators it's a play on this name here, Dibon, that we read about. And now he's called, instead of Dibon, call it Dimon, call it blood. Because they're going to be slain by those waters. And then he says, the lions upon him that escapeth of Moab and upon the remnant of the land. The Assyrians wouldn't destroy all of them. There'd be a remnant. But the lions will get them. That could be the beast that inhabited those lands in those days, but knowing our history, the Babylonians would come later. They're the ones that are going to wipe Moab out about 100 years later after the Assyrians come through. And their symbol is often the symbol of a lion. So it's thought maybe this is looking forward all the way into the time Babylon is going to come and take Moab out. Let's go to chapter 17. You need to flee for escape. And it says, send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah to the wilderness unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. You know what Mount Zion is? That's Jerusalem. You need to send a lamb to Jerusalem. Now, lamb can be used for sacrifice, but a lamb could also represent a peace offering. Your hope, Moab, is going to lie in Jerusalem. And sure enough, the Assyrians that come across the land weren't able to take Jerusalem. And the refugees from that Assyrian invasion would go to Jerusalem, go to Mount Zion. For it shall be that, and look at this, as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. You think about a little bird cast out of the nest, so helpless. That's how those refugees will be, trying to escape the Assyrians, just like a little helpless bird cast out of the nest. And it says, take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday, hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth. He's saying, you in Jerusalem, when they come to you, these refugees, hide them under your shadow. Let them seek refuge here in Zion and find safety there. Let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Now, again, that's the King James Version. It's a little hard to read that. It sounds like the outcast would dwell with Moab, but Moab are the ones that are being outcast in the context. Let those outcasts of Moab come dwell with you in Zion is the significance here. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. For the extortioner is at an end, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressions are consumed out of the land. And then this verse, and in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it. In truth, in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hastening righteousness. We're going to return to that verse in a moment. But the verse sounds messianic, doesn't it? I'll show you in just a little bit. We've heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath, but his lies shall not be so. He can't deceive himself and think he is proud. Moab will be laid waste. Verse 7, therefore shall Moab howl for Moab. Everyone shall howl for the foundation of Kirhassereth shall ye mourn. Surely they are stricken. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sema. The lords of the heathen have broken down the principal plants thereof. They are come even unto Yazer. They wander through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out. They're gone over the sea. Therefore I will bewail with the weeping of Jazer. Isaiah is not glad to deliver this burden. He sees what's happening and says, oh, I just weep for what's going to happen to you, Moab. It talks about the vine of Simna. I will water thee with my tears, he says. O Heshbon, O Eliah, for the shouting of thy summer fruits, and for the harvest is fallen. All those summer fruits, those figs and things that they produce. Great rejoicing when the summer fruits come, but no, the harvest, it's not going to fail. You won't be able to gather them. And the gladness is taken away, and the joy out of the plentiful field, and in the vineyard shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine in their presses. See, they gather the grapes in, and the treaders would tread on the wine to squeeze the juice out of the grapes. That fresh grape juice coming out of those grapes there is called wine, which is really what the Bible word for wine means. It's simply the juice of the grape. It wouldn't have been alcohol then, but the juice of the grapes coming out of those presses. And it says, I have made their vintage shouting to cease. Oh, the shouting would be the rejoicing at the harvest. But no, I'm going to cut that off. They won't be rejoicing over this harvest. Wherefore my bowels shall sound like a harp for Moab. And in the poetic parallel, my inward parts. That's the bowels. From deep inside, I'm going to moan and grieve for Moab. And it shall come to pass, when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high place, that he shall not come to his sanctuary to pray. He shall come, but he shall not prevail. And that's where we started. Going up to the high places, but they come down weeping. They may go to their sanctuary to pray, but it's not going to help them. The Assyrian armies are going to come and reap this destruction. When's this going to happen, Isaiah? This is the word the Lord hath spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord hath spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of a hireling, the glory of Moab shall be contained with all that great multitude, and the remnant shall be small and feeble. Okay, let that illustrate the weeping and howling for Moab. All right, there we go. Thanks for helping me in my lesson. That's just how it's going to be, okay? In 3 years. So that's how we know we're talking about the Assyrians. From the time Isaiah spoke, it was Assyria that came upon Moab in that time. 100 years later, another prophet, Jeremiah, would be talking about the Babylonians coming. And he'd prophesy much the way Isaiah did. He'd say, we have heard of the pride of Moab. He's exceeding proud. His loftiness, his arrogancy, his pride, and the haughtiness of his heart. In Jeremiah 48:42, Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because the Lord hath magnified himself against, because they magnified themselves against the Lord. And after the Babylonians came through 100 years later, you don't read about the Moabites. They vanish away as a distinct people. All the land is still there, but the people are gone that inhabited that land. The last we read of Moab is in Zephaniah 2, verses 8 through 10. I've heard the reproach of Moab, where they've reproached my people and magnified themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom. This shall they have for their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of the Lord of hosts. So today, Moab is no more. In mercy shall thy throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hastening righteousness. Isaiah 16 and verse 5. And by itself, that seems out of place. But in the context of Isaiah, what we've been reading, remember chapter 2? The mountain of the Lord's house established in the top of the mountains, and all nations shall come to it. And now here we have Moab coming to Mount Zion seeking refuge. And Isaiah sees beyond all this and talks about a king that'll be in Zion. That's that king to which we would all come. Christ ascended from Mount Zion into heaven, for he is crowned king. And so scattered throughout the book of Isaiah are these little hints and ideas. They're not exactly quoted in the New Testament, but knowing the New Testament story and looking back, we see prophecies of the Messiah that is to come. And he's the one that sits seeking judgment and hastening righteousness. Okay, that's the lesson. That's pretty tough material, isn't it? Isaiah chapters 15 and 16. But it'll help us understand and appreciate that prophet. And two lessons here, two lessons to leave with. Moab was destroyed because of their pride. What's that tell us? We don't need to be proud. Jesus began his preaching saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's the humble, the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There's many that have never received Christ. They're too proud. They don't want to be identified with those old Christians out there, and so they keep themselves aloof. And I tell you, the Assyrians aren't coming, but the Lord will come back again, and there'll be a day of judgment. And you don't want pride to destroy you. You need to humble yourselves and become obedient to the King in Zion and become obedient to Jesus. Be baptized into Christ. Be added to His church. Become part of His kingdom. Isaiah said He would come, and He has come. And now we can be part of that kingdom and seek refuge in Him. And so with that, I'm going to leave this lesson with you. And if you're ready to put on our Lord in baptism, then you have a chance to do that as we stand and sing this invitation song.